September 1944. The war was turning against Germany. Allied forces pushed deeper into Nazi-occupied Europe with each passing day. Thousands of German Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves captured on battlefields across France and Belgium. These men were loaded onto trucks, then trains, then ships that crossed the English Channel. They were heading to Britain as prisoners of war. For years, these soldiers had been fed a constant stream of Nazi propaganda. Their leaders told them that black people were subhuman. The propaganda films showed black people as inferior beings who could not think clearly or act with dignity. The Nazi education system taught that only white Europeans, especially Germans, could build great nations or fight with honor. These beliefs were drilled into every German soldier from the moment they joined the military. Now these men were about to see something that would shake everything they thought they knew. Britain in 1944 was a nation completely focused on winning the war. Food was strictly rationed across the country. British civilians could only buy 16 ounces of meat each week. Sugar, butter, and eggs were precious commodities that families saved carefully. Cities like London and Coventry still showed terrible scars from German bombing raids during the Blitz. Entire neighborhoods sat in ruins. But Britain was far from alone in this fight. The British Empire stretched across the globe, and soldiers came from every corner of it to defend the mother country. Over 150,000 colonial troops served in the British Armed Forces. These men came from British West Africa, the Caribbean islands, India, and other colonies. Many of these soldiers were black men who wore the same uniforms and carried the same rifles as their white British brothers in arms. Some were stationed permanently in Britain. Others rotated through on leave from combat zones. They walked the same streets, ate in the same mess halls, and fought in the same war as white British soldiers. Camp 186 sat in the Yorkshire countryside, surrounded by rolling green hills and stone walls that had stood for centuries. The camp held roughly 4,000 German prisoners of war. Row after row of curved Nissen huts stretched across the muddy ground. These metal half-cylinder buildings would be home for the prisoners until the war ended. Tall, barbed wire fences surrounded the entire camp. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by British soldiers with rifles. The German prisoners arrived exhausted and confused. Many were young men barely out of their teens. Others were seasoned veterans who had fought since the invasion of Poland in 1939. They came from all over Germany. Hans Müller was a machinist from Hamburg who knew how to work with metal and machines. Ernst Weber had been a farmer's son from Bavaria. Friedrich Hoffmann taught mathematics at a school in Berlin before the war. Otto Schmidt worked in his father's bakery in Dresden. These men had different backgrounds, but they all shared the same Nazi education about race. The prisoners expected certain things when they arrived at the British camp. They expected to see white British soldiers as guards. They expected that if any black people were present, those people would be doing the lowest jobs, cleaning latrines, carrying bags, scrubbing floors, maybe working in kitchens in the back where no one could see them. This matched everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. This matched the way the German military treated people from Eastern Europe and other groups they considered inferior. The prisoners thought they understood how the world worked. White people gave orders, everyone else followed those orders. The shock began during the very first moments at the camp. The prisoners lined up for intake processing. They needed medical inspections to check for diseases or injuries. They needed to have their names recorded. They needed to receive their prisoner numbers and camp assignments. A British sergeant walked down the line with a clipboard. He wore a perfectly pressed uniform with 3 stripes on his sleeve showing his rank. His boots were polished to a high shine. He carried himself with confidence and authority, and he was black. The sergeant was from Jamaica, one of Britain's Caribbean colonies. He spoke clear English with a Caribbean accent. He ordered the German prisoners to form straight lines. He told them where to stand. He checked their names against his list. He was doing the job of a military administrator, with complete professionalism. The German prisoners stared in disbelief. Hans Müller felt his stomach tighten. This was not supposed to be possible. A black man was giving them orders. But what shocked Müller even more was watching the white British guards. They showed the Jamaican sergeant complete respect, not the fake politeness someone might show to an animal they were training. not the careful tolerance someone might show to a simple-minded person. The White Guards treated this black sergeant as their equal in every way. When he gave an order, they followed it immediately. When he spoke, they listened carefully. One white British corporal even saluted him when reporting for duty. Müller later wrote in his diary about this moment. He described how a black man in full uniform ordered them around. He wrote that the British Guards showed this man genuine military respect, the same respect they would show any other sergeant. The dissonance grew stronger over the first few days. The word dissonance means when two ideas clash so badly that it hurts to hold both in your mind at the same time. The German prisoners were experiencing this mental pain. Everything they had been taught said that black people could not hold positions of authority. Everything they were seeing said the opposite. In the mess hall, the prisoners watched white and black guards eat together at the same tables. They shared cigarettes during breaks. They joked and laughed like old friends. The prisoners saw a black corporal from Trinidad supervising work details. White British soldiers followed his orders without any hesitation or resentment. To men who had grown up with Nazi racial doctrine, this was not just surprising. It was fundamentally impossible. It was like watching water flow uphill or seeing the sun rise in the west. According to everything they believed about how races interact, what they were witnessing could not exist. Yet here it was, happening every single day, as normal and ordinary as rain falling from clouds. The contradictions kept multiplying. Each day brought new observations that challenged what the German prisoners thought they knew about the world. The camp had a large, open field where British guards sometimes organized football matches during their off-duty hours. The prisoners watched from behind the fence as these games unfolded. Black and white British soldiers played on the same teams. A white soldier would pass the ball to a black teammate without a second thought. They celebrated goals together, slapping each other on the back and laughing. When disputes arose about whether a ball went out of bounds, black and white players argued their cases with equal voice. No one treated the black players as less important or less skilled. They were simply teammates, playing a game together on a cold Yorkshire afternoon. The camp had a small library where prisoners could borrow books and read British newspapers. The guards allowed this because they believed exposure to free press might help re-educate the Germans away from Nazi thinking. Ernst Weber spent hours in that library, partly to improve his English and partly because he was genuinely curious about British society. The newspapers showed him a Britain he never imagined existed. There were photographs of black air raid wardens helping civilians during bombing attacks. Black factory workers assembled artillery shells and airplane parts in munitions plants. Black civil defense volunteers dug through rubble searching for survivors after German bombs fell. In every photograph, black and white Britons worked side by side. The newspaper articles described their contributions to the war effort in the same respectful tone, regardless of skin color. Weber found this deeply confusing. The Nazi propaganda machine had always claimed that racial mixing destroyed a nation's strength and efficiency. Yet, here was Britain, mixing races freely, and Britain was winning the war. The camp infirmary provided another shock to the German prisoners. A medical officer from British Guiana ran the facility. British Guiana was a colony on the northern coast of South America. The doctor was a black man who had studied medicine at a university in London. He wore the rank insignia of a captain on his uniform. When German prisoners fell ill or got injured during work details, this doctor treated them with professional care. He examined symptoms carefully. He asked detailed questions about medical history. He prescribed medications and monitored recovery. Otto Schmidt developed a severe infection in his hand after cutting it on barbed wire. The infection spread rapidly, causing red streaks to run up his arm. The British doctor recognized the danger immediately. He administered sulfur drugs, a modern antibiotic that was still relatively new. He cleaned and dressed the wound with expert skill. He checked on Schmidt every day until the infection cleared. Schmidt later admitted to other prisoners that the doctor's competence was undeniable. The man had saved his hand, possibly his life. This was not the work of someone inferior or incapable. This was the work of a highly trained physician who happened to be black. Christmas 1944 arrived with cold winds and grey skies. The war still raged across Europe, but international agreements required that prisoners of war receive decent treatment, especially during holidays. The Red Cross sent 200 parcels to Camp 186. Each parcel contained chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat, cheese, and other small luxuries. The distribution of these parcels was handled by a black quartermaster sergeant from British West Africa. He had a small office near the camp storehouse. The sergeant maintained detailed records of every item that came in and every item that went out. He used a complex system of cards and ledgers to track inventory. When it came time to distribute the Christmas parcels, he did so with absolute fairness. Each prisoner received exactly one parcel. The sergeant cross-referenced names against his master list to prevent anyone from getting two. His record-keeping was meticulous, and his organizational skills were obvious. Ernst Weber watched this process with growing unease. He later remarked to Hans Müller that the British trusted this black sergeant with supplies worth thousands of pounds. In the German Wehrmacht, Weber said, they would not trust a Slavic person with a simple clipboard. Yet here was a black man managing complex logistics for an entire prisoner of war camp. British civilians who owned farms near the camp sometimes hired prisoner work crews to help with agricultural labor. Britain needed every hand it could get to grow food during the war. German prisoners were put to work, harvesting potatoes, picking apples, and repairing stone walls around pastures. These work crews were supervised by British soldiers, both white and black. The German prisoners found themselves taking orders from Jamaican corporals and African sergeants who knew farming inside and out. These supervisors organized efficient work schedules. They demonstrated proper harvesting techniques. They maintained discipline without cruelty or excessive punishment. During breaks, some of these black soldiers taught the German prisoners British songs to help pass the time. They shared stories about their home countries. They treated the prisoners firmly but fairly, like workers who needed management rather than enemies who needed crushing. This casual camaraderie was impossible for the Germans to understand. Nazi ideology taught that different races could not work together peacefully, yet here they were, working together every day under autumn sunshine and spring rain. What struck Friedrich Hoffmann most deeply was watching how British civilians interacted with black servicemen. When the work crews labored on farms, the farmer's wife would sometimes bring out tea for everyone during the afternoon break. She served the black British soldiers first because they were the supervisors. She offered them biscuits and asked polite questions about how they were managing in the cold British weather. Her teenage daughters helped carry the tea trays. They spoke to the black soldiers with the same casual friendliness they showed to white soldiers. There was no fear in their eyes, no disgust, no sense that these men were dangerous or improper to be around. The girls treated them as ordinary young men who were far from home and fighting a difficult war. They asked about the soldiers' families back in Jamaica or Africa. They laughed at jokes. They showed basic human kindness without any sense that this was unusual or wrong. The contrast extended far beyond questions of race. The camp's kitchen facilities demonstrated industrial efficiency that amazed the German prisoners. The kitchens produced 12,000 meals every single day. Mechanical potato peelers could process hundreds of pounds of potatoes in an hour. Conveyor belt ovens baked bread continuously. Refrigeration units kept meat and vegetables fresh. Even under strict wartime rationing, the prisoners received 2,800 calories daily. This was actually more food than many German civilians were getting back home as the Allied bombing campaign destroyed German supply lines. The British camp meals included fresh vegetables at least 4 times per week. The prisoners received meat twice weekly, usually beef or mutton. They ate white bread, which had become a luxury in Germany, where bread was now made with sawdust and other fillers to stretch the grain supply. The abundance was striking and impossible to ignore. The moment of ideological collapse came differently for each prisoner, but it always came. For some men, it happened suddenly, like a dam breaking. For others, it was gradual, like ice melting in spring sunshine. Hans Müller experienced his breaking point in March 1945. The camp commandant arranged for a special visitor to give a presentation to the prisoners. A Royal Air Force pilot came to speak about the Commonwealth Air War against Germany. The pilot was a black man from Trinidad. He wore his RAF wings proudly on his chest along with ribbons, showing he had flown dozens of combat missions. He walked into the camp assembly hall with confident strides. His uniform was perfectly pressed. His shoes gleamed under the electric lights. The pilot spoke for nearly an hour. He described complex tactical operations over German cities. He explained how bomber formations protected each other during long night raids. He talked about the technical specifications of the Lancaster bomber, rattling off numbers about engine power, bomb capacity, and maximum altitude as easily as reciting a poem. When prisoners asked questions, he answered with precision and depth. One German prisoner asked about fuel consumption rates at different altitudes. The pilot pulled a small notebook from his pocket and sketched out calculations right there, showing how air density affected engine efficiency. Another prisoner asked about defensive tactics against German night fighters. The pilot described barrel rolls, corkscrew maneuvers, and other evasive techniques with the ease of someone who had performed these moves dozens of times while bullets and flak exploded around him. He spoke 3 languages fluently: English, French, and Spanish. He had attended university before the war. He was intelligent, educated, brave, and highly skilled. Hans Müller sat in the audience, feeling something inside him shatter. He had been taught his entire life that black people could not achieve these things. The Nazi education system presented black people as simple-minded, incapable of complex thought or advanced learning. Yet here was a man who flew one of the most sophisticated machines humans had ever built. A man who made life and death decisions at 300 miles per hour while enemy fighters tried to kill him. A man who navigated by stars and instruments across hundreds of miles of darkness to find precise targets and return home safely. Müller later wrote in his diary that everything the Nazis taught him was a lie. Not propaganda that bent the truth slightly, but completely and fundamentally false information. The gap between what he had been taught and what he was witnessing was so enormous that his entire worldview collapsed. If the Nazis had lied about something this basic and this obvious, what else had they lied about? What other truths had been hidden from the German people? The work details continued throughout the spring as the war in Europe entered its final weeks. German prisoners assigned to agricultural labor found themselves working under the supervision of soldiers from Jamaica and West Africa. These men possessed deep knowledge about farming that came from generations of agricultural tradition in their home countries. They knew which crops grew best in different soil types. They understood weather patterns and planting schedules. They organized harvest operations with impressive efficiency, making sure no labor was wasted and no crops were left to rot in the fields. They maintained discipline among the work crews, but without the harsh cruelty that German prisoners had experienced in their own military. When someone made an honest mistake, the supervisors corrected them calmly and showed them the right way to do the task. When someone worked especially hard, the supervisors offered genuine praise. During the long hours in the fields, these black soldiers sometimes taught the German prisoners British songs. They sang while they worked to make the time pass more quickly. The melodies were simple and the words were often funny. Some songs told stories about going home after the war. Other songs made jokes about military life and the silly things soldiers had to do. The German prisoners found themselves singing along, stumbling over English pronunciation but enjoying the sense of shared humanity. This casual friendship was completely at odds with everything Nazi ideology taught about racial relations. The Nazis claimed that different races could never truly cooperate or find common ground. Yet here were men from completely different continents and cultures, working together peacefully, even finding small moments of joy in song and shared labor. Ernst Weber reflected on this strange situation. He wrote in a letter home, which was censored but preserved in British archives, that the Nazis called the British Empire weak and corrupted by racial mixing. But Weber was seeing efficient organization, industrial abundance, and soldiers of all colors working as brothers in arms. How could a weak and corrupted nation dominate half the world? How could they be winning the war against Germany? The contradiction gnawed at him constantly. The camp education program added another layer to this transformation. British authorities believed that exposing German prisoners to free press and alternative histories might help them reject Nazi thinking. The camp library received newspapers, books, and magazines every week. Prisoners could read about world events from perspectives other than Nazi propaganda. But the most powerful education did not come from books or newspapers. It came from simple observation of daily life in the camp. Friedrich Hoffmann was a former mathematics teacher who prided himself on logical thinking. He tried to make sense of what he was seeing using reason and evidence. The Nazis taught that racial mixing destroyed military effectiveness. Yet Britain's mixed forces had defeated Germany. The Nazis taught that only Aryan people could create advanced civilization and sophisticated technology. Yet black engineers maintained British tanks and trucks. Black doctors healed wounded soldiers. Black administrators ran supply chains that fed millions of troops across multiple continents. The evidence contradicted the theory at every single point. As a teacher, Hoffmann understood that when evidence contradicts a theory, the theory must be wrong, no matter how deeply you believed in the theory, no matter who taught it to you. The evidence was what mattered. The most dramatic transformation happened to Otto Schmidt, the baker's son from Dresden. In April 1945, Schmidt developed terrible pain in his lower right abdomen. The pain grew worse over several hours until he could barely walk. The camp doctor, a white British physician, recognized the symptoms immediately. Appendicitis. The appendix was inflamed and would soon burst if not removed surgically. The problem was that the camp's regular surgeon was away helping with casualties from the final push into Germany. The only surgeon available was the black doctor from Sierra Leone, who usually handled routine medical care. Schmidt had no choice. The infection would kill him within days if the appendix was not removed. He was taken to the camp's small operating room. The Sierra Leonean surgeon scrubbed his hands carefully. He put on a surgical gown and mask. He explained the procedure to Schmidt in calm, professional English. Schmidt lay on the operating table feeling genuine fear. Not fear of the surgery itself, but fear that came from his Nazi indoctrination. He had been taught that black people were intellectually inferior. Could such a person really perform delicate surgery? Would the doctor's hands be steady enough? Would he know what to do if complications arose? The surgery took less than an hour. The doctor made a precise incision in Schmidt's abdomen. He located the inflamed appendix and removed it cleanly. He stitched the wound with neat, even sutures. He monitored Schmidt carefully during recovery to watch for signs of infection. Within a week, Schmidt was walking around the camp again. Within 2 weeks, he was back to full health. Schmidt later admitted to other prisoners that lying on that operating table was a moment of truth for him. A black man literally held his life in his hands, and that man had saved him with skill and knowledge that took years of study to acquire. Schmidt suddenly understood something fundamental. Dignity and skill had nothing to do with skin color. They had nothing to do with the shape of someone's nose or the texture of their hair. These qualities came from education, practice, character, and dedication. Schmidt realized he had been living inside a monstrous delusion. The Nazi racial ideology was not just wrong. It was evil because it blinded people to the humanity and worth of other human beings. When Hans Müller returned to Hamburg in late 1946, he carried 3 things with him. The first was a duffel bag containing his few belongings. The second was 15 extra pounds of weight on his frame from the regular meals he received in British captivity. The third was a completely transformed worldview that would shape the rest of his life. The ship that brought him and other released prisoners across the North Sea docked in a German port on a grey morning in November. Müller walked down the gangplank onto German soil for the first time in over 2 years. What he saw broke his heart. The Third Reich, that had promised to create a 1,000-year empire of racial supremacy, had delivered only ruins and despair. The master race was reduced to scavenging through rubble for anything useful. The train ride from the port to Hamburg took hours because so many rail lines had been destroyed by Allied bombing. When Müller finally arrived in his home city, he barely recognized it. Entire neighborhoods had been turned to dust and ash. 60% of Hamburg's buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged. Mountains of broken bricks and twisted metal-lined streets where apartment buildings once stood. Survivors moved through this wasteland like ghosts. Their faces were hollow from hunger. Their clothes hung loose on thin frames. Children played in bomb craters, having never known a world without war and destruction. The contrast hit Müller with physical force. He remembered the British camp with its heated barracks and consistent meals. He remembered the industrial kitchens that produced thousands of meals daily using mechanical equipment. He remembered receiving medical care when he got sick and educational opportunities to learn new skills. The British had treated their enemies better than Germany now treated its own citizens. Müller's family had survived, though his father had died in an air raid 2 years earlier. His mother and sister lived in the basement of their partially destroyed home. They had no running water. Electricity came on for only a few hours each day. Food was desperately scarce. His mother looked 20 years older than when he last saw her. She cried when she saw him standing in the doorway. She was so happy that at least one of her sons had survived. Müller's younger brother had been killed fighting Russians on the Eastern Front. Over dinner that night, which consisted of watery soup and a small piece of bread, Müller tried to explain what he had seen in Britain. His mother listened quietly as he described black soldiers commanding white troops. He told her about the Jamaican sergeant who processed prisoners with professional efficiency. He described the Sierra Leonean surgeon who saved Otto Schmidt's life with skillful surgery. His mother was silent for a long time. Finally, she said that the propaganda had lied about everything. The government had sent millions of young men to die for ideas that were completely false. What a waste. What a terrible, senseless waste. Many returning prisoners of war became quiet advocates for change in post-war Germany. They had seen something that most Germans never witnessed. They had seen a different way of organizing society, a way that did not depend on hatred and false ideas about racial superiority. Ernst Weber joined anti-fascist education programs run by the Allied occupation authorities. He traveled to schools across the British occupation zone, giving talks to young Germans. He told them about his time as a prisoner in Britain. He described watching black and white soldiers work together as equals. He explained how this cooperation made Britain stronger, not weaker. Weber would tell students that he learned more about true humanity in a British prisoner of war camp than in a lifetime of Nazi schooling. He said that cooperation between different races was not weakness but strength. The students listened carefully. Many had lost fathers or brothers in the war. They were hungry for honest answers about why Germany had failed so completely. Friedrich Hoffmann returned to teaching mathematics in Berlin. The city was now divided into occupation zones controlled by different Allied powers. Hoffmann taught in the British sector, where he could speak openly about his experiences. He incorporated lessons about critical thinking into his mathematics classes. He taught students that when evidence contradicts a theory, you must change the theory, not ignore the evidence. He sometimes shared stories about the black British soldiers he met in the camp. He told his students about the Royal Air Force pilot from Trinidad who could perform complex calculations in his head. He explained that intelligence and capability existed in people of all backgrounds. The job of education was to help each person develop their potential, not to tell them that some people could never achieve great things because of how they looked. Hoffmann believed that Germany's future depended on rejecting the poisonous ideas that led to the war. His students carried these lessons with them as they helped rebuild their shattered nation. Otto Schmidt took the longest path to healing. The man whose life had been saved by a black surgeon struggled with shame and guilt for years after returning home. He eventually became a physician himself, studying medicine at a university that had been rebuilt from ruins. Schmidt specialized in surgery, inspired by the doctor who operated on him in that British camp. He practiced medicine with a philosophy that came directly from his prisoner of war experience. Schmidt often said that the true measure of civilization was not racial purity. It was how you treated people who were different from yourself, even your enemies. He refused to turn away patients based on their nationality, religion, or background. He treated Turkish immigrants with the same care he gave to native Germans. He trained young doctors and nurses from all over the world. When colleagues occasionally made racist remarks, Schmidt would quietly but firmly correct them. He would tell the story of lying on an operating table in a British prisoner of war camp, his life in the hands of a black surgeon from Sierra Leone. That experience taught him that prejudice was not just morally wrong. It was also foolish because it blinded you to the talents and humanity of others. The story of German prisoners confronting Britain's racial integration revealed a deep irony that shaped the entire war. Nazi Germany's racial ideology was supposed to make the nation stronger. Hitler and his followers believed that racial purity would create a superior fighting force. They thought that segregating and eliminating people they considered inferior would concentrate power and ability in the master race. But the opposite was true. Nazi racial ideology actually weakened Germany by cutting the nation off from the talents and contributions of millions of people. It created a rigid, inflexible society that could not adapt or learn. Meanwhile, Britain's willingness to use talent regardless of skin color gave them enormous advantages. They could draw soldiers from across their empire. They could put the best person in each job, whether that person was white, black, or brown. They could build an efficient military machine that judged people by competence rather than complexion. These were not symptoms of weakness or corruption. These were foundations of victory. As Friedrich Hoffmann wrote in 1947, the German prisoners spent years conquering nations they considered inferior. They believed they were spreading civilization and order to lesser peoples. Meanwhile, Britain had built an empire by recognizing that human potential existed in every race and every nation. The British system was far from perfect. Their empire had many cruel and unjust elements, but in this one critical way, Britain understood something that Nazi Germany refused to accept. Hoffmann wrote that the prisoners learned in captivity what they should have known in freedom. Prejudice does not protect the strong. It blinds them to the strength of others. This blindness cost Germany everything. The prisoners who witnessed Britain's imperfect but functional racial integration carried a truth home with them. Human dignity, capability, and worth transcend the boundaries that people try to draw between races. Otto Schmidt expressed this truth most clearly in his later writings. He said that in losing the war, the German prisoners gained something more valuable than victory. They gained a more accurate understanding of humanity itself. They learned that the things that make people worthy of respect, the things that make civilizations great, have nothing to do with skin color or racial background. These things come from character, education, effort, and the willingness to treat others with basic human dignity. The Nazi ideology had promised to elevate Germany to greatness through racial purity. Instead, it led the nation to ruin through willful blindness about human nature. The prisoners who returned from British camps brought home a different vision, a vision of society where people were judged by their contributions rather than their appearance, where talent was recognized wherever it appeared, where cooperation across differences created strength rather than weakness. This vision helped shape a new Germany that rose from the ashes of the old, a Germany that learned, painfully and at terrible cost, that humanity cannot be divided into superior and inferior categories, that every person deserves dignity and every person possesses potential. These lessons, learned by young soldiers in British prisoner of war camps, became part of the foundation for a better future.